introducing our speaker for today. David Weiss is a research assistant here full-time with CARS and KBS, but also a PhD student, mentored by Jingong Li over in geography and atmospheric science, who my lab works very closely with Jingong's lab, and it's been a great relationship. David comes to us from Burlington, Vermont, we'll say, is close enough, but also with many stops in between here and there, and including what was it, a master's at Wake Forest in sustainability. Is that program, sustainability program there, and so David, like me, is just kind of a remote sensor by accident. I want to say neither one of us have really had any formal training in the field. And David truly is, I'd say, like a Swiss Army knife, a jack of all trades, and it's been a tremendous asset to our lab. And this is just but one or two of the things that he's working on with all the different lines of research we have going on. And I guess I'll let you take it from here. This is field station related stuff to start. That's pretty cool. I don't think anybody's taken a deep dive into the data, the aerial data that as you have. So with that, welcome David Weiss.
Thank you. So start with an overview here. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about remote sensing fundamentals, and then we'll get into this NSF neon hyperspectral imagery. And initially, this was a part of one of the field station awards. And then I'm going to talk a little bit later about scaling some of these concepts up to using satellite imagery for Eastern Red Cedar detection and monitoring in Kansas. So first of all, what do we mean by remote sensing? The term can mean a lot of things, but generally in the Kansas applied remote sensing context, we mean drone, aerial, so like an airplane, or satellite imagery. Today we're going to be looking mostly at optical remote sensing. So the sun is our energy source, and we're looking at how objects reflect the sun's radiation. So real briefly here, I wanted to introduce the concept of spectral ecology, which is a framework that has become, it's kind of expanded over the past 5 or 10 years. Traditionally in remote sensing, when we think about ecological analyses, we think about sort of these things over here, maybe broad response to environmental changes, and of course, scaling upward from spectrometry or spectroscopy in the lab. But more recently, with better data and improved technology, some ecologists are taking a look at traits and interactions, form and function, and isolating phenotypic information. And so this kind of exists. I like this figure across scale. We can kind of think of these different collection methods moving along with ecological scales of analysis. So one example here from the USGS Spectral Library, and this is actually a mineral, but just to get an idea, is in laboratory analysis, we can get a pretty detailed profile, but as we move upward, we end up with more general profiles that are harder to distinguish from one another. And so today I'm going to be talking about vegetation response. So some quick background here. Generally speaking, vegetation absorbs a lot in the visible light spectrum, particularly red and blue, because these are photosynthetic pathways. Green as well. This range is mediated by pigments and leaves and vegetation. As we transition into the near infrared, that interaction is mediated more by cellular structure, the mesophyll. And then this is an older CARS graphic, but we'll be talking about shortwave infrared 2 in a few slides with this neon AOP imagery. And so real quickly here, some spectral profiles from the field station of few different tree canopies, and we can see, point here is that vegetation tends to have a similar response curve. So we see in the visible light, the absorption, reflectance in the near infrared, and then a lot what happens down here in the shortwave infrared relates to water content and a few other factors. So in addition to all that comes with measuring vegetation, when we move away from the subject, there are a number of other things that we have to consider with our data, and those include clouds, snow and ice, time of day, time of year, and all of this has implications on data quality and what we can do with an analysis. So three major concepts are temporal resolution, spectral resolution, and spatial resolution. And generally speaking, with most remote sensing products, it's kind of at best pick two of these. You'll never really get all three, but there are also limitations with coverage. So there are a lot of trade-offs here. And depending on the type of analysis, that really will dictate what product you might use. And so here's a brief overview of when these might be important. And so over here with the neon aerial hyperspectral imagery, we have great spectral resolution and coverage and a relatively high spatial coverage, but we don't have very good spatial resolution. That is, we don't have very good spatial coverage, and our temporal resolution, initially it was yearly, now it's gone down. I think there's some uncertainty about what it's going to look like, but it could be every 2 to 5 years. In contrast, satellite product, we might sacrifice a bit on spatial resolution and spectral coverage and resolution, but we have much better temporal resolution and coverage. So briefly, why are we interested in the neon AOP data? So this is an opportunity to really look at how things interact in these spectral bands that we don't have much access to otherwise. And so in spite of the sort of once a year collection, we can kind of get a better idea, scaling up and inform our approaches for other instruments like satellites. One of the other things that we can do is create training data, and we can put that into a model to train satellite imagery data. That's another approach that we use sometimes. So just a comparison here, this is a figure from that both USGS and the European Space Agency use. It's not necessarily the clearest figure, but the neon HSI is covering this entire range between the red arrows, and it's collecting at very fine increments, whereas satellite will have different slices. So there's a lot of detail in these other areas that we can use. So some of the objectives for this project were to access the data and make it more accessible for others to use. But we really didn't have much of a feel for what the quality would look like. And because of this, it was hard to come up with a plan in advance. So we had to sort of change course several moments. But ultimately, we wanted to see, would this be useful for classifying deciduous trees by genera? And one of the reasons for that is that this is sort of a challenge, but also a reasonable goal, unlike an analysis looking at grasses, where you might have many species within a square meter. Trees are bigger. So that's one extra layer of complication that we're avoiding, but also these differences are subtle enough that we can test sensitivity and quality. Down here is just an example of some intercrown variation in a false color composite from this data. So in the beginning, we want to do a time series analysis. We had these 4 years. There were some problems with the 2019 data. However, I started pulling this data, and this was something like 2 terabytes of data just for this small area. And it turned out that it looked like this. So you can see the lawnmower lines. This makes it fairly challenging to classify, and it also makes it challenging to quantify change over time. By 2020, it had improved slightly, but this was still a pretty big obstacle. And initially, we looked to try to correct this. But at the same time, Neon was going back and reprocessing some of their data to add something called a VRDF. And fundamentally, with the idea here, these are some textbook photos. But if you're, depending on whether the sun is behind you or in front of you, the object will look very different. It's kind of like taking a picture into the light, or having the sun be in front of the subject. And so they added this correction to fix those lawnmower lines. And ultimately, we did have a significant improvement. So we switched to looking just at this 2023 data. However, doing some more stretching in some of the bands, we still have some data quality problems. See these artifacts here. We're not entirely sure what the source of those are, but we'll have to do some further work to try to eliminate that or not use those bands. So given the data quality, ideally we would have a lot of ground reference data. We started out by taking a look at some of this neon vegetation structure data. However, delineating which trees are represented from above was fairly challenging, and we didn't quite have enough data points. There's some spatial uncertainty, and the canopy density is high. But this does bring me to a canopy height model, because we figured we might be able to sample out of this to figure out which tree is represented in the canopy. So this is also collected with this neon data, and so LiDAR sensor, and there are 2 returns. The first return is usually the first object it hits, so we have an idea of those elevations, and then we can subtract the ground or the bare earth from beneath it and get an idea of canopy height. So right here on the left is a canopy height model in meters for the field station. And then over here on the right, I took 2023 and 2017 and took the difference so we can see difference in growth. These areas in the dark blue and the black over here, generally when they do this, they remove the areas that have little difference. So grass in those areas aren't really detected in this, but we do have somewhat of an idea of what's going on with the canopy. And so now to take a little look at a few false color composites from this data, from the hyperspectral data. We'll run through and kind of identify some patterns here. These are the same band combination. The one on the right has a more aggressive contrast stretch. And part of the reason we do this is because we can't represent the full data on a computer screen. So there can be a lot hidden in it when you do a visual analysis. This is kind of interesting because, as most of these bands, the Eastern Red Cedar really stands out. And we'll touch a little bit on that later, but we can see some other patterns in the canopy as well. And then here's another band combination that shows a little bit different differentiation in the canopy. One thing I want to point out, and we'll take a look at this more closely in a moment, is that there is some difference in terrain, slope, and elevation throughout this area. And this can impact both measurement, but it can also impact the distribution of species and how they grow and their phenology. So there are a number of different factors that might be influencing these patterns we see. And finally, this one, which is pretty interesting because these deciduous trees down in this area stood out. And so we're wondering if that is real or not. Comparing it with the canopy height model, we can see that this pattern holds true. They are a fair bit taller than other trees in the area. We're unsuccessful in trying to identify what they might be from Google Street View. But if anybody knows what's growing down there, that would be kind of interesting to add to this. And you'll also notice we're seeing some of that artifacting come back in. So that's another challenge for a more quantitative analysis. And then here next to a hillshade, shaded relief of the terrain data, you can sort of see how these patterns emerge along either side of this bluff here. And ultimately in a model, we might combine these data sources and use both in combination to delineate patterns. So second example here from North Lawrence. This is yet a different band combination. We can see a few things going on here, including a handful of trees that have more than one response in the same canopy. But down close to the river, we see some spectral divergence and also a difference in the canopy type model. So this is pretty promising for detecting a difference in tree type. So for this, in terms of future directions, we need to do some more data cleaning. We need a lot of ground reference data to really probably get a classification. And then finally, one other interesting thing at a closer scale that NEON also collects is this phenocam data. And these are kind of like webcams that collect infrared, near infrared, and just red, green, blue channels. They collect on a daily basis. So we're closer to the canopy. And this is something that could be interesting to explore and compare with these other data sources, and perhaps tell us more about these interactions at this scale. So that's an approach that covers a high spectral resolution. And we also have a fairly good spatial resolution. But what happens if we have a high temporal resolution instead? But our spatial resolution isn't as good, and we only have a few bands to work with. There's still a lot we can do for differentiation and identification. These figures are from a project Jude did some years ago, and he's using just the normalized difference vegetation index, or the difference between near infrared reflectance and red absorbance, and how these change over the course of a year to distinguish between crop type. And then ultimately down here, he could generate a map that shows crop type by field. And so leading into Eastern Red Cedar in Kansas, in this case, because we're going for statewide coverage, we are using a satellite product. So we have roughly 5-day return time, though this varies, and clouds, snow, atmospheric conditions can interfere a lot. So it's not like there are a lot of gaps in the data ultimately. But one of the virtues is the spatial coverage. We do lose some spatial resolution, and then we also lose some spectral resolution and coverage. So this was a Kansas View project, and initially we were seeking to extend Chen Liang's work classifying Eastern Red Cedar at the field station. But we ran into a few challenges, and those turned out to be have some pretty interesting reasons for why those might be. So one of the things is that training data didn't generalize well to the rest of the state. This seems to speak more to the diversity and phenology of Eastern Red Cedar. And we also had a lot of confusion with cover crops in some grassland areas, though it distinguished well between deciduous trees. So it seems fairly easy to separate Eastern Red Cedar, maybe conifers in general, from deciduous tree cover, but grasses, alfalfa, that's another matter. So now we're going to take a look comparatively between a few different of these data sources and false color images at the field station. First, I want to start with this aerial image from 1941. And this is an interesting image because you can see in some of these clearing areas that what was a clearing then is now red cedar. And largely where the deciduous forest was, it remains. And you can see, if I flip back and forth here, this area of red cedar. And there are other red cedars around. Looking at Landsat imagery, where temporal coverage goes back to the 70s, although the better imagery starts in 1984. We don't pick up much of a red cedar signal in this area until the early 90s. I'm not sure what the history was there, but it didn't seem to really take over that area until then. And then this is an example of the high spatial resolution NG911 imagery that DASC distributes from 2014 in a true color composite. And then we have our neon imagery in a false color composite. And then by contrast, the USDA NAPE aerial imagery, which is similar in a lot of ways to the NG911, but it's collected in summer rather than winter. And then this, getting into a little bit more later, is a fairly interesting false color composite with the NAPE imagery, and it is near infrared, green and blue. One thing to notice about this is how different the red cedar looks. And we're not quite sure whether this is time of year or moisture. It's probably a little bit of both. But 2019 was a very wet season, and it's much more distinguishable this season than it is in other years. And so by contrast here, in 2023, the imagery was collected late in the season, and we have a very different image coming out. And the red cedar does not stand out quite as much as it did before. And so the Sentinel-2, we lose some spatial resolution. Here's a true color image. It's not particularly easy to see and distinguish it from the other vegetation, at least in the true color. But using a shortwave infrared, near infrared, and red composite, we can see these differences again. One interesting thing I found with the shortwave infrared is that it helped, particularly the specific band, distinguish between the red cedar and certain grassy areas. In other bands, we could distinguish between broadleaf vegetation and red cedar. But over here, there was a lot of confusion, except with this band in particular. And then here is a look at NDVI. This is fairly common with conifers. They do have lower NDVI values. So our initial strategy was to use winter imagery. And so red cedars are green in the winter as evergreens, and not much else is. So this should be a fairly, straightforward way of classifying. And particularly in Kansas, where the bulk of our evergreens are red cedar, we're kind of willing to live with confusion with pines and other evergreen species. But we did run into a lot of problems, including snow contamination and sun angle, as well as winter cover crops. And given all the imagery we had to throw out, balancing a narrow enough time window with enough quality imagery became a challenge. And ultimately, we shifted towards kind of a manual decision tree, leveraging some of these features of the red cedar. And we're able to come up with a classification somewhat like this. We went with sparse, moderate, dense because the sensitivity varies across the state. And there are also some other challenges with subpixel analyses, especially at this general level that are involved. But we did have some fairly good luck with this approach, and we have that data layer out for 2021 on the CARS website. And so back to this dynamic of why the red cedar looks like this. So one of these early papers from the 90s They take a look at conifers versus a sugar maple, and a lot of the work with this near and SWIR reflectance and conifer species is done in boreal environments. So that is one caveat here, but it still should broadly hold true. In this paper, they look at the difference between these reflectances at the needle, branch, and canopy levels. And one of the things that was interesting about this is as we zoom outward, the reflectance diverges a bit more in the near infrared and shortwave infrared. And this is an interesting characteristic. Historically, we've had trouble quantifying these response curves with conifers because they're difficult to get under the instrument. There have been some improvements in that work, but this spatial scale difference is pretty interesting and might explain why we see some of these differences in the red cedar. So with that Sentinel-2 imagery, one of the other things I tried is by taking a spatially average about 70 meter by 100 meter plot in the field station, and then another in the Red Hills. And I wanted to look at their annual NDVI signal. And then also on this plot is one with another 70 by 100 meter of deciduous canopy at the field station, and we can kind of see our seasonal oscillation with NDVI is expected. When the vegetation senesces and loses its leaves, we get a drop in NDVI since there's nothing there to absorb that red light and photosynthesize and reflect that near infrared. There's a much more depressed pattern with the red cedar, but what's interesting here is the difference between how it behaves in the Red Hills and at the field station. And there are a couple of things about this. We think precipitation gradient might have something to do with it. There are also probably some other climatic variables at play. There could also be some genetic variation in the populations of trees as well. And then, so pulling the NDVI signal apart and looking just at the red, which is the band 4, the near infrared, that's the band 8, which make up NDVI, and then band 11, which is the shortwave infrared. There's also a pretty distinctive seasonal variation between deciduous trees and how this behaves in red cedar. And so fundamentally, the red cedar are photosynthesizing pretty consistently throughout the year, throughout each season, which we might expect, whereas deciduous trees are showing kind of the traditional pattern, seasonal pattern here. And this is kind of the component of the NDVI and how we get those values in the previous slide. What is interesting is that, like a lot of vegetation, the deciduous trees are reflecting more shortwave infrared in the winter, and then absorbing more of it in the summer. And the red cedar have a fairly different pattern here. So one of the things about this is returning to that difference in scale. There's probably these mechanisms of needle scattering from branch to canopy probably have a pretty big reason why we see this pattern versus broadleaf plants. But it also probably accounts for why with some grasses we see some similar patterns and have some trouble distinguishing between them. And the same goes for some of these crops as well, particularly alfalfa. That was one of the most difficult ones to deal with. And so some future directions here, we've talked about using that higher spatial resolution winter imagery that the state of Kansas collects. This would give us an opportunity to detect much smaller plants than we might be able to with satellite imagery. It also comes with its own challenges as well. And then the other thing is this was done in Google Earth Engine, and there are some data quality limitations in Earth Engine. So moving this analysis globally, we could use data with better pre-processing and perhaps improve the quality that way. And then I'd just like to thank everybody at Kansas Applied Remote Sensing. And then I guess it's time for questions. Brian.
Nice talk.
Thanks.
Two things. So early on, you did an analysis of canopy height in the pitch. Can you use that to detect gaps, disturbed areas where trees have come down, and
Yes.
maybe use that to quantify size and distribution of canopy disturbances and gaps? I'm thinking about when the ash trees die and they start forming gaps.
And actually, I'll find that slide in a second. But one thing too is I believe some of the orangey areas in this image, not all of them, did appear to be trees that were kind of dying from the interior. So we think possibly ash. But let's see here. I've already gone past that. So so this image here, anywhere you see red is about a 5 meter or greater decrease in height. So these would be areas where there's probably a disturbance. And then the areas that are transparent, there was no change. And then the greener it gets is where we're seeing more growth. There is some noise in this data, and then this is about 6 years, but we can indeed detect disturbances this way.
The other question real quick was fragmentation plots. Are these, is this data not high enough resolution to zoom in and actually quantify the cedar coverage in those small patches?
We can probably use it that way. So this is also 1 meter data set. And again, there is some noise. I believe Jude has done some preliminary analysis in the past on the change in vegetation on those fragmentation plots using this data. And then ultimately in Chen's study on the Eastern Red Cedar at the field station, she did look at the winter collections that they use for the state, for state LiDAR, and looked at growth rate during the winter months with the idea that the red cedar would be continuing to grow during the winter, whereas deciduous trees would not be. So yeah, there's definitely some potential in there as well.
Could you explain again why you thought the grasslands in alfalfa were being conflated with the
Yeah, so when we get into those infrared bands, the mechanisms of reflectance change a bit. One of the things about it is the kind of macro structure is probably more responsible for the differences we're seeing. And so the broadleaf, we kind of have more surface area to look at and look at the interaction. But especially with red cedar, which has a much smaller needle size, it's probably scattering the light locally in different ways. And some grasses might be doing something similar. That's probably not the only thing going on, but that's sort of what this study here gets at is the farther away you look at it, the less reflectance you get, or is making it back to the sensor.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking, like, when you were originally presenting this, I was like, oh, okay, maybe it's the sensor. So I was just curious if you thought it was color or what. I didn't understand.
Right, no, that's another good point though, because in these models, we tend to try to use as much information as possible. So even things that you can see visually might be a component of this. So yeah, the amount of green that's being absorbed or reflected can also be a part of a bigger model. So that can also be a component of it too. In this case, the really major separation was in the infrared. But there's also a component of moisture and how the plant might deal with moisture that relates to what we might see in these responses and why the temporal aspect is so important too. Tom?
With that, is it possible to combine the canopy height model and that to, like, so then you take out anything over like the difference if it's super short?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's actually one of the methods for some of these broader land cover classifications, some of which Dana had worked on. It's kind of a data fusion approach, so we can train a model using both derivatives of these canopy height and terrain data, as well as the spectral data, and put that together and look for relationships. Sarah?
Just related to the canopy height question, could we use that to assess the age of, like, the different patches of cedars that are out there to get kind of a successional gradient
Yeah, I think we could, particularly with the change component. So if we see, greater growth, and again, there's some patchiness with years of data collected in its quality. So 2016 wasn't very good quality. So I did the difference between 2023 and 2017, but we can stack those together and take a look at that change over time, and where the red cedar might be more static, it might have matured. And we can also, look at the absolute height too and get an idea as well. And one other thing I want to mention too, real quick. So there are two more neon AOP sites in Kansas. One is at Kanza, and it covers a fairly big area, including part of Manhattan, sort of like our imagery dips down into Lawrence. There's another site that's more focused on water resources that's south of Kanza, but they also collect this aerial imagery and LiDAR data for that site as well. So if we get some of these quality things worked out, those will probably apply to the other sites, and we might be able to get some data sets that could be useful for analyses in those places as well.